Hey, if you follow me on Instagram or Patreon, you know that I recently received one of the new Ruger Redhawk 8-shot 357 Magnum revolvers. This was actually a gift from forgedfromfreedom.com. Those are the people that make most of the t-shirts that you see in my videos. They sent me this gun as a gift, as a thank you for being so nice and promoting their t-shirt company, which I thought free t-shirts was enough of a thank you, but this is above and beyond. In fact, if I'd have known in the past you can get something like this for free just by being nice to someone, well, I wouldn't have put so much effort into being a dick all the time. But now that I know, maybe I will start being nicer to people. So go over to their website, buy some t-shirts, help them make back the money they lost by giving me this. I know you're not getting anything out of that. Well, you're getting a t-shirt, but well, helps me, helps them. I'm a little bit selfish sometimes. But to get back to the gun itself, one thing a lot of people have asked me since they knew I got this gun is, how does it compare to my Smith & Wesson 627 8-shot snub-nose revolver? So today I'm going to take a moment and compare these two guns physically. How do they stack up to each other as far as size is concerned, weight, build quality, etc. Now before I go into it, I will say I prefer Smith & Wesson. Always have. It's not a brand loyalty, it's just I think they're made better. I think the Smith & Wesson is made better than the Rugers. But there are things the Rugers can do that the Smith & Wesson can't, and we'll talk about that in this comparison. So let's get started here. Now remember, this is not a range review, it's just a physical comparison. So let's look at them side by side and see which one of these guns might be better for you. First, let's just look at the weight. The weight of the Smith & Wesson is right at 36 ounces. That's basically 2¼ pounds, so it's definitely not a light gun. But when you look at the Ruger, it's about 42½ ounces. That's nearly ½ a pound heavier than the Smith & Wesson. Still, neither of these guns are light, so if you're going to carry either one of them, you're going to need a pretty significant rig to do so comfortably. Now, the extra weight of the Ruger might handle the recoil a little better, but the Smith & Wesson is going to be easier to carry every day because it's lighter. So I'd give the edge a little bit to the Smith & Wesson, but like I said, with these two guns, weight really isn't that big of an issue to me. Neither one of them are going to carry easily. Now let's look at the size of both guns, and let's start with looking at the height of the guns. If you'll notice, the Ruger on my left here is taller. It's about ½ inch taller, but it's not only taller, it's thicker. The grip is thicker. The Smith & Wesson tapers more at the bottom. Overall, the Smith & Wesson is not only thinner, but it tapers more. So the Smith & Wesson is going to carry more easily. This longer grip and thicker grip on the Ruger is going to print more. Now, when it comes to overall length, the two guns are almost identical. Both guns have a very similar length. But once again, you're going to notice that the Ruger, once again in my left hand here, is much thicker. It's a thicker gun overall. Got to remember, the Ruger has a cast frame. The Smith & Wesson has a forged frame. So therefore, the Ruger has to be a little thicker just to maintain the proper strength. Now let's get a little closer up here and look at the cylinders on both guns. That's where you're going to see the biggest difference. Not only is the Ruger cylinder thicker, it's also considerably longer, and it's longer for a very good reason. The Ruger cylinder is made from bar stock. Now the bar stock is very strong, but it's not quite comparable to a good forged cylinder, so it needs to be a little bit thicker. The reason it's longer is so it can take heavier loads. Now the Smith & Wesson cylinder is a forged cylinder, so it can be a little bit smaller and still be as strong, but it's shorter, which means it can't take some of the higher loadings that the Ruger can take. Some of the Ruger only loads produce a longer round. It takes up the entire cylinder just because you got to get more powder in there. So they're made for the Ruger. This one will fit them. If you tried to put those same rounds into a Smith & Wesson, they would either just not fit and the cylinder wouldn't close, or if you tried to make them short enough to fit, you would end up over-pressurizing that round and basically turning it into a little bomb, which would not be a good thing in any gun. So if you're going to want to use those maximum loads, like say maybe you're going camping somewhere where you might encounter a bear or a wild hog or something, well then the Ruger's going to work better for you. The Smith & Wesson just can't handle that. And another good thing about the Ruger cylinder is it fills up the frame. Since these are both larger frames made for 44 Magnums, the Smith & Wesson cylinder leaves a big gap up here and you got a big forcing cone. I just don't like that at all. So when you look at size, the Ruger is definitely bigger and once again will be harder to carry, but like I said, it's going to be able to handle a stouter load. So if you're wanting a gun that's as powerful as possible, go with the Ruger. But once again, if it comes to carrying it or just overall build quality and refinement, I'm going to have to say the Smith & Wesson is still the better gun. And speaking of refinement, let's look at the refinement on the Ruger. How much attention do they pay to small details? Well, on the Ruger, there's not much refinement. It's pretty blocky, it's pretty thick, there's a lot of square cut edges, there's really not a lot of fancy millwork on this gun. The gun is cut for moon clips, but that's about it. That's about as detailed as they get. That's really evident with their hammers. I've never liked their hammers. This just looks like it's been cut out of a flat piece of steel. I've never understood why they can't make a little bit more refined hammer. This looks like it hasn't been milled at all. Now the Smith & Wesson is a different story. It's much more refined. Slab side barrel, cuts to the barrel, nice edges, nice lines. They really put a lot more effort into making this gun a little sleeker and a little nicer looking. Although I'm going to say the Rugers look great too. If you look at the hammer on the Smith & Wesson, you understand exactly what I was talking about. This is what a hammer should look like, not that thing on the Ruger. Now the Smith & Wesson is also cut for moon clips, just like the Ruger. But if you pay attention to one more little detail about the cylinder here, if you look at the little holes for the rounds, they actually look bigger on the Smith & Wesson. Now you might say it's just because the cylinder is a little smaller, but it's not. It's because the cylinders are chamfered. These cylinders have a little chamfer cut on every one of them, makes them much easier to load, makes them much nicer to look at even. That's a little extra detail that makes this gun just so much nicer in my opinion. Now some people are of course going to want to know about the sights, but really when it comes to these two guns, the sights are so similar, there's not even really any point in talking about them. They are pretty much the same thing, and you can get aftermarket sights of multiple different styles for both guns. So the sights are pretty much a wash. Another thing we can compare is the grips. The Smith & Wesson grips are much nicer. They're actually more in proportion to the gun. The only problem I have with them is I just wish they would quit pretending that we're all living in the Simpsons world where we have 3 large fingers. Human beings have 4 fingers. These never line up with anybody's fingers. I don't know why they do this. I wish this was more of a flat front. The Ruger does have the flat front. It does look a little bit out of scale to the gun since this gun is bigger and thicker, but it's actually pretty comfortable. I actually prefer this flat front end to the grooves on the Smith & Wesson. I just wish we could get some grips somewhere in between the two of them for both guns. Okay, one last thing I'll mention is the triggers on both guns. Now, the Smith & Wesson has about a 9-pound double action pull and has about a 3.5-pound single action pull. Very crisp, very smooth, something that you would expect from the Smith & Wesson Performance Center. Now, the Ruger trigger is a little heavier with about a 10.5 to 11-pound double action and about a 4.5-pound single action. Now, one thing I will say about the Ruger though too, you do feel more of the cylinder cycling when you pull. If you pull slowly, you really feel that cylinder lock into place a lot more than you do on the Smith & Wesson, so you get that click before you actually release the hammer. I'm assuming that's probably because of the fact that it is such a large, heavy cylinder, but still, it's overall a really good trigger. Both guns have nice triggers on them. So as you can see, in the end, once again, I still think the Smith & Wesson is the better gun. But the Ruger definitely has its place, and it's an awesome gun. If I was going to go camping, the Ruger is the one that would go with me, not the Smith & Wesson. If I was going to carry it for everyday carry, the Smith & Wesson would be the one I carried, not the Ruger. So even though I think the Smith & Wesson is a little bit finer gun, overall, the Ruger is something I'm definitely glad I have, something I appreciate having, and something I really, really like. So it'll be up to you which one you think would be better. If you're someone that wants a Jeep Wrangler, you'd probably want the Ruger. If you're someone that would prefer a Mercedes G-Class, you'd probably appreciate the Smith & Wesson. But in the end, they're both awesome guns. It's just up to you to decide which is better for you.